Welcome. You've made it here. The day is behind you with all its noise and demands. Let them fade like echoes. Let the stillness gather around you. The world outside is quieting, and within that quiet, a different kind of light begins to glow. Tonight, let's take a journey. Not through space, but through mind. Not across galaxies, but across ideas. Across questions that have no single answer. Across lifetimes of seeking, doubting, wondering. Across everything that ever asked, what is this life? But before we journey, consider subscribing so you never miss our almost daily video. And let us know, where are you tuning in from? Your voice is part of this shared reflection. This is the story of philosophy, of thought, of the mind reflecting on itself, of people, ancient and modern, staring into the unknown and whispering, why? No need to memorize the names or years. No need to hold tightly to every idea. Let your thoughts float. Let your awareness soften. Let the centuries drift past like leaves on a river. You are part of this story too. Thought lives in you. And like the stars, it doesn't mind if you drift away. So we begin where all philosophy begins, before the books, before the systems, before the words etched into stone. There were only questions. Long before cities, before alphabets, there were people gathered around fires, watching the stars, wondering where the fire went when it died, what caused the wind, what dreams meant, what happened when the body stopped moving. These were not just idle thoughts. They were urgent, felt in the bones. The first humans did not call this philosophy, but it was. The love of wisdom was already there, in the silence after the story ended, in the curiosity burning behind the eyes. They looked at the sky and asked, who are we? What is this? They looked at death and asked, what comes after? Why must we go? They looked at themselves and asked, am I just a body, or is there something more? The first philosophers were not named. They left no writings, no treatises, only the trace of wonder that still hums inside you when you look at the stars and fall quiet. Picture them, these first seekers, in caves painted with handprints and animals, around fires that pushed back the darkness. Their questions were immediate, pressing. When the hunt failed, when the rains didn't come, when children were born or elders died, the questions rose like smoke. What makes things alive? What is the difference between sleep and death? Why do we dream of the dead? What is justice? Should we share the kill, or does strength make right? They developed the first ethical systems without calling them that. Rules for living together. Taboos that kept the group safe. Stories that explained the inexplicable. And in all of this, the seed of every philosophy that would follow. The shamans, the storytellers, the wise women and medicine men, they were the first to wrestle with the deepest questions, to stand at the boundary between the known and unknown, translating mystery into meaning. Time moved forward, civilizations rose like waves, and in one small corner of the Mediterranean, something stirred. In the city of Miletus, around 600 BCE, thinkers began to turn their attention not just to gods and myths, but to nature itself, to logic, to the mind. They asked, what is the world made of? What remains the same, even when everything changes? Thales said, water. Everything flows from it, returns to it. The earth floats upon it like a ship. Anaximenes said, air. Invisible, but everywhere. The breath of the cosmos, condensing into clouds, rarefying into fire. Heraclitus said, fire, and that all things flow. Nothing stays. You cannot step into the same river twice. The path up and down are one and the same. Conflict, he taught, was the father of all things. Without opposition, without tension, there would be no world at all. But Parmenides disagreed. Change, he insisted, was illusion. The senses deceive. Only being is eternal, unchanging one. Everything else? Just shadows dancing on the cave wall of appearance. These were not just guesses. They were beginnings. The first whispers of science, of metaphysics, of abstraction, ideas breaking free from ritual and walking into the open air. Then came Pythagoras, who heard harmony in the numbers, who discovered that musical intervals could be expressed as mathematical ratios. The cosmos itself, he believed, was a vast musical instrument, playing the music of the spheres. All is number, he declared, and in numbers he found the hidden order beneath the chaos of appearances. His followers lived in communities, sharing property, studying geometry, seeking purification through knowledge. They believed the soul was immortal, trapped in cycles of rebirth, and that only through wisdom could it find release. And soon, like fire catching dry grass, philosophy spread. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle. Socrates, who walked barefoot through Athens, asking questions that cut through pretension like wind through cloth. Who claimed to know nothing, and in that, found truth. The oracle at Delphi had called him the wisest man in Athens, but Socrates discovered his wisdom lay precisely in knowing the limits of his knowledge. He questioned everyone, politicians, poets, craftsmen, and found that those who claimed to know the most actually knew the least. His method was simple but devastating. Keep asking, "What do you mean?" until the comfortable assumptions crumbled away. The unexamined life is not worth living, he said at his trial. Rather than flee Athens or renounce his mission, he drank the hemlock. Death was just another question to explore. Plato, his student, who saw two worlds, the one of senses and the one of pure forms. He believed in a reality beyond reality, where justice, beauty, and truth lived like eternal stars. This world of appearances, he taught, was like shadows on a cave wall. The real world lay behind us, accessible only through reason and the soul's remembering. In his Republic, he imagined an ideal state ruled by philosopher kings, not because philosophers should have power, but because only those who understood the good could rule justly. His academy in Athens became the first university, its motto, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." And Aristotle, the student of Plato, who brought the heavens down to earth, who studied biology, logic, ethics, who classified, observed, and taught that happiness was the goal of life, not pleasure, but eudaimonia, a flourishing of the soul in accordance with virtue. Where Plato looked upward to eternal forms, Aristotle looked around at the world itself. He dissected animals, catalogued plants, studied constitutions. He invented formal logic, the science of valid inference, and he asked, "What makes a life worth living?" His answer, excellence, but not perfection, rather the habit of doing well what human beings are meant to do. Courage in battle, generosity with wealth, friendship in relationship, contemplation in study. Virtue, he said, is like playing a musical instrument. It requires practice, and even then, one performance doesn't make you a musician. It's the pattern of your whole life that matters. They didn't always agree, but together they shaped a conversation that would ripple for thousands of years. Their questions still echo in classrooms, in quiet corners of libraries, in your own mind when the world slows down. While Greece was asking, "What is the world made of?" In the East, the question was softer, more inward. What is the self? How should one live? What is suffering, and how might we be free of it? Far before Socrates walked the streets of Athens, the sages of India were already meditating by riverbanks. They spoke of Brahman, the eternal, unchanging ground of all being. They whispered of Atman, the soul, identical in essence to the cosmos. And they dreamed of moksha, freedom from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth. The Upanishads were not arguments. They were like songs, reflections spoken in twilight, quiet revelations passed from teacher to student, like flame from candle to candle. Tat tvam asi, they whispered, thou art that. The individual soul and the universal spirit, not two, but one. The wave realizing it has always been the ocean. In forest clearings and mountain caves, seekers practiced yoga, not just physical postures, but the discipline of uniting the finite self with the infinite. They discovered states of consciousness beyond waking, dreaming, and sleeping. They mapped the subtle anatomy of the soul. Then came Buddha, the awakened one. Not a god, but a man who sat beneath a fig tree and saw through illusion. Born Siddhartha Gautama, a prince who renounced his palace to seek the end of suffering. He tried extreme asceticism, nearly starving himself to death. But enlightenment didn't come through punishment of the body. It came through the middle way. Neither indulgence nor denial, but balance. Under the Bodhi tree, he saw the four noble truths. Life contains suffering. Suffering comes from attachment, from craving what is not permanent. There is a way to end suffering. The way is the eightfold path. Right understanding, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right concentration. No need to change the world, no need to conquer kingdoms. Just see clearly. Breathe. Be still. His teaching spread not through conquest, but through example. Monks in orange robes walking from village to village, begging for food, offering wisdom in return. A philosophy without a philosopher god, pointing always back to direct experience. In China, around the same time, another quiet mind walked the land. Laozi, the old master. Legend says he was keeper of the archives, a scholar who grew tired of civilization's complications. When he finally left the city, the gatekeeper begged him to write down his wisdom before disappearing into the wilderness. The result was the Tao Te Ching, 81 short chapters about the way. Not a path to follow, but the rhythm of the universe itself. Like water, the Tao flows around obstacles, soft but unstoppable. To know others is wisdom, he wrote. To know yourself is enlightenment. The Tao is not a thing but a principle, the source and pattern of everything that is. It cannot be named, for naming limits it. It cannot be grasped, for grasping changes it. The wise person lives Wu Wei, acting without forcing, governing without controlling, leading by following the natural flow. The sage does not attempt anything very big, and thus achieves greatness. And then Confucius, who saw harmony not in withdrawal, but in relationship, father to son, ruler to subject, friend to friend. He believed virtue was not just a private matter, but a public good, that society could be wise if it honored respect, ritual, and kindness. Where Laozi counseled withdrawal from social complexity, Confucius dove deeper into it. He studied the ancient rituals, the classical texts, the proper relationships that bind a civilization together. Not because he loved rules, but because he saw in them the crystallized wisdom of centuries. Do not impose on others what you do not wish for yourself, he taught. 5 centuries before a similar golden rule appeared elsewhere. He believed in the perfectibility of human nature through education, moral cultivation, and proper example. A ruler should be like the North Star, fixed in virtue, while all else revolves around that center. His follower Mencius taught that human nature was originally good. Children instinctively help those in distress. Evil came from neglect, from failure to cultivate the seeds of compassion that heaven planted in every heart. These ideas did not compete. They coexisted, like streams flowing through the same valley. India gave the world the inward gaze, the recognition that liberation comes from understanding the nature of consciousness itself. China gave it the balance between order and flow, the recognition that wisdom means living in harmony with the deeper patterns of existence. Their teachings endure, not as systems to memorize, but as paths to walk, quiet steps through noisy times. Back in the West, the philosophers of Greece had grown older. The golden age had passed. Socrates was gone. Plato's academy stood in shadow. Alexander's empire had crumbled into pieces. And yet, the questions remained. What is a good life? What can we control? How do we find peace in a world that refuses to obey us? The Stoics answered with steel and serenity. Founded by Zeno of Citium around 300 BCE, Stoicism taught that the universe was rational, governed by divine logic, the Logos. Our task was not to fight this cosmic order, but to align ourselves with it. Epictetus, born a slave, taught that we cannot control what happens to us, only how we respond. You are not what happens to you. You are how you choose to respond to what happens to you. External circumstances, wealth, health, reputation, these are indifferent. What matters is our judgment, our character, our choice to act virtuously regardless of outcome. Seneca, a Roman statesman and advisor to emperors, wrote letters to friends about death, time, and freedom. Wealthy and powerful, he nonetheless practiced poverty voluntarily, sleeping on hard floors and eating simple food, not from masochism, but to prove to himself that he could lose everything and still be free. Every new beginning comes from some other beginning's end, he wrote. Death is not the opposite of life, but its completion. The wise person thinks of death daily, not morbidly, but as a reminder of what truly matters. Marcus Aurelius, emperor of Rome, kept a journal beneath his armor. While managing an empire that stretched from Britain to the Euphrates, while fighting wars on distant frontiers, he reminded himself, gently, daily, that all things pass, and that virtue is the only true wealth. Very little is needed to make a happy life, he wrote to himself. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking. The Stoics developed practices that sound surprisingly modern: negative visualization, imagining loss to appreciate what you have, the discipline of desire, wanting what you get instead of getting what you want, the view from above, seeing your troubles in cosmic context. To live well, the Stoics said, is to live in agreement with nature, to accept what is, to be just, to train the mind like a muscle, and when death comes, to greet it not with fear, but with calm. But not everyone agreed. The skeptics doubted that we could know anything at all. Pyrrho, who traveled with Alexander to India and may have learned from Buddhist and Hindu sages, taught that for every argument, an equally compelling counter-argument could be made. The wise response? Epoche, suspension of judgment. Stop claiming to know, and peace will follow. Sextus Empiricus refined this into a sophisticated epistemology. We cannot know things in themselves, only how they appear to us. And appearances vary with circumstances, culture, individual disposition. The skeptic neither affirms nor denies, but investigates, and finds in this very investigation a kind of serenity. The Epicureans believed pleasure, not excess, but peace, was the highest good. Epicurus taught that the gods, if they exist, do not interfere in human affairs, and death is nothing to us. For when we are, death is not yet there, and when death is there, we are not. Fear of death and fear of the gods cause most human suffering. Remove these fears through philosophical understanding, and pleasure, defined as the absence of pain and anxiety, naturally follows. The Epicurean garden was a community of friends devoted to philosophical conversation, simple pleasures, and mutual care. Friendship dances around the world, proclaiming to all of us that we must wake up to the recognition of happiness. And the Cynics rejected wealth and custom, living in simplicity, like dogs under open sky. Diogenes, the most famous, lived in a barrel, owned nothing but a cloak and a cup, which he threw away after seeing a child drink from cupped hands, and mocked social conventions with brilliant wit. When Alexander the Great found him sunbathing and offered to grant any wish, Diogenes replied, "Stand out of my sunlight." True wealth, he believed, was wanting nothing that you did not already have. They were all asking, what is happiness? What is truth? And how should a person be? Not questions to be answered once, but companions for life, to be returned to. Lived. As Rome fell and the Western world grew quiet, another voice began to rise. It did not speak from marble temples or shaded gardens, but from deserts, monasteries, and candle-lit scriptoria. Philosophy, once a free-thinking dance of questions, now intertwined with faith, with mystery, with revelation, with God. The early Christian philosophers asked not just what is truth, but who is truth. They believed that reason and faith were not enemies, but companions, like two wings lifting the soul toward understanding. They believed that the universe had been spoken into being by a word, logos, a rational order that echoed through creation. Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century, saw Christ as the logos made flesh, the same rational principle that Greek philosophers had glimpsed through reason. Truth was one, whether discovered through philosophy or revealed through Scripture. Augustine, a restless heart turned saint, wrote of time, memory, and the nature of evil. Born in North Africa to a Christian mother and pagan father, he spent his youth in pursuit of pleasure and intellectual achievement. He followed the Manichaeans, who taught that the world was a battleground between good and evil. He read the Platonists and found them beautiful but incomplete. Then, in a garden in Milan, he heard a child's voice singing, "Take up and read." He opened Paul's letter to the Romans and found his answer. Grace, not effort, was the path to peace. His Confessions became the first psychological autobiography, a mapping of the soul's journey from pride to humility, from seeking God everywhere to finding God within. "You have made us for yourself," he wrote, "and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." He asked, "What is time? Past exists only in memory, future only in expectation. Only the present is real, but it vanishes the moment we try to grasp it. Time," he concluded, "is the mind's way of measuring change. And perhaps God, eternal and unchanging, experiences no time at all. And evil? Not a substance created by God, but a privation. The absence of good, as darkness is the absence of light. Free will makes evil possible, but free will itself is good, for without it, love would be meaningless." Then came Boethius, writing from a prison cell. Once the most powerful man in Rome after the emperor, he fell from favor and was condemned to death for treason. In his cell, he composed The Consolation of Philosophy, imagining a lady philosopher visiting him in his darkest hour. She reminded him that fortune turns like a wheel, that suffering is not the end, and that the soul is free even when the body is chained. True happiness cannot be taken away by external circumstances, for it rests in the good itself, eternal, unchanging, available to any soul that turns toward it. Nothing is miserable unless you think it so, philosophy tells him, and on the other hand, nothing brings happiness unless you are content with it. In the East, the Desert Fathers pursued silence. Anthony, Paul, Pachomius, they fled the cities for the Egyptian desert, seeking God in solitude and simplicity. Their sayings, preserved by disciples, read like Zen koans, brief, paradoxical, pointing beyond words to direct experience. Someone asked Abba Anthony, "What must one do in order to please God?" The old man replied, "Pay attention to what I tell you. Whoever you may be, always have God before your eyes. Whatever you do, do it according to the testimony of the Holy Scriptures. In whatever place you live, do not easily leave it. Keep these 3 precepts, and you will be saved." In the West, monks copied texts, preserved thought, and built a bridge from the ancient world to the one still being born. By the Middle Ages, that bridge was firm. In cathedral schools and growing universities, a new kind of thought began to rise, sharp, systematic, a towering structure built from question and reply, like stone upon stone. This was scholasticism, and its great architects were men like Thomas Aquinas. Aquinas believed that truth was one, whether revealed by reason or by faith. That philosophy could not contradict theology, because both came from the same light. Born into Italian nobility, he shocked his family by joining the Dominicans, an order devoted to study and preaching rather than worldly advancement. At the University of Paris, he encountered the complete works of Aristotle, recently translated from Arabic. Many Christians feared these pagan texts would corrupt the faith. Aquinas saw them as gifts, tools for understanding God's creation more deeply. He asked whether God existed, and answered, not with emotion, but with syllogism. 5 ways he proposed, each beginning with something we observe in the world and reasoning back to its ultimate source. Motion implies a first mover. Causation implies a first cause. Contingency implies necessity. Degrees of perfection imply perfect being. Design implies intelligence, not proofs in the mathematical sense, but demonstrations. Ways of showing that belief in God is reasonable, not contrary to logic, but completion of it. He believed in natural law, a moral order woven into the fabric of creation. Human beings have purposes, as arrows have targets. Our deepest purpose is happiness, which comes from union with the highest good. From this teleological foundation, he derived a comprehensive ethics covering everything from war to commerce to family life. Others debated the nature of universals. When we say red about roses and apples and fire trucks, are we referring to some universal redness that exists independently? Or are universals just names we use for similar things? The realists, following Plato, said universals exist in a transcendent realm. The nominalists said they're just words. Flatus vocis, breath of voice. The moderates sought a middle way. William of Ockham, a Franciscan, developed the principle of parsimony that bears his name. Don't multiply entities beyond necessity. The simplest explanation is usually correct. This Occam's razor would later help give birth to modern science. Duns Scotus emphasized God's will over God's intellect, divine freedom to create any world whatsoever. What we call good is good, not because it conforms to eternal rational principles, but because God commands it. They wrote in Latin. They argued for days about questions that seem abstract now. Can angels occupy the same place? How many could dance on the head of a pin? But beneath the seemingly pointless scholastic debates lay serious questions about the nature of space, time, individuality, and knowledge, questions that would reshape philosophy when the medieval synthesis finally broke apart. It may seem cold now, this medieval logic, but beneath it burned devotion, a belief that the universe made sense because its author was rational, just, and good. While Europe struggled through shadows, the Muslim world kept the flame of philosophy alive. From the conquest of Alexandria in 641 CE to the fall of Córdoba in 1236, Islamic civilization stretched from Spain to Central Asia. In Baghdad, Córdoba, and Cairo, scholars gathered around texts both ancient and new. They read Aristotle and Plato, not in fragments, but in full, translated into Arabic, commented upon, debated, loved. The translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries was one of history's great intellectual achievements. Greek philosophy, Indian mathematics, Persian astronomy, all rendered into Arabic by teams of translators, many of them Christians and Jews working alongside Muslims. Al-Kindi, the philosopher of the Arabs, argued that truth could not conflict with truth. Revelation and reason pointed toward the same reality. He wrote on mathematics, music, medicine, and metaphysics. A true Renaissance man centuries before the Renaissance. Al-Farabi, the second teacher after Aristotle, imagined the perfect city ruled by philosopher prophets, like Plato's philosopher kings, but guided by both reason and revelation. He mapped the stages of human knowledge from sensation through imagination to intellect, showing how the mind ascends from material to spiritual reality. Then came Avicenna, Ibn Sina, perhaps the greatest philosopher-scientist of the medieval world, physician, poet, mystic, rationalist. He wrote over 200 works on everything from logic to love. His floating man, thought experiment predates Descartes by centuries. Imagine a person created suspended in void, unable to see or touch anything, even their own body. Would they still know they exist? Yes, through pure self-awareness, independent of sensory experience. The soul, he concluded, is not identical with the body. He distinguished between essence, what something is, and existence, that it is. For everything contingent, these are separate. We can know what a unicorn is without knowing whether unicorns exist. But in God, essence and existence are identical. God cannot not exist. His medical encyclopedia, the Canon, was used in European universities for centuries. But his mystical writings speak of the soul's journey through stages of knowledge toward direct union with the divine intellect. Al-Ghazali, the great synthesizer, initially attacked the philosophers for compromising religious faith with Greek rationalism. Then, he experienced a spiritual crisis. All his knowledge felt hollow, unable to bring certainty or peace. He left his prestigious teaching position to wander as a Sufi seeker. When he returned to writing, it was with a new appreciation for the limits of reason and the necessity of mystical experience. His incoherence of the philosophers devastated Aristotelian metaphysics in the Islamic world. But then came Averroes, Ibn Rushd, who defended reason against those who feared it. Born in Córdoba, trained as a judge, he wrote massive commentaries on Aristotle that shaped Jewish and Christian as well as Islamic thought. He believed that truth could not be harmed by questions, that the Quran and philosophy pointed to the same light, accessible through different paths suited to different minds. The masses needed concrete imagery and moral guidance, The philosophical elite could handle abstract demonstration. Both were valid approaches to the same divine reality. His Incoherence of the Incoherence systematically refuted Al-Ghazali's anti-philosophical arguments. Reason and revelation, he insisted, could not truly conflict. Only our understanding of them could be incomplete or mistaken. Their work traveled back to Europe, through Spain, through Sicily. It shaped Aquinas. It revived the West. And in a quiet irony, as Islamic philosophy began to fade under the pressure of religious conservatism, its echoes were waking minds across Christendom. The Middle Ages passed like a long twilight, and then, quietly at first, the light began to change. Manuscripts once forgotten were read again. Statues buried in dust were raised back into sunlight, and the world, long focused on the heavens, began to look again at earth and at man. This was the Renaissance, a rebirth, not just of art and architecture, but of thinking itself. Constantinople fell to the Turks in 1453, sending Greek scholars westward with precious manuscripts. The printing press spread ideas faster than ever before. Trade routes brought new wealth and new perspectives. The discovery of the Americas shattered ancient geographic certainties. Humanism bloomed, an idea that man was not merely a sinner in need of grace, but a creature capable of beauty, reason, and freedom. The image of God reflected in mortal form. Petrarch, the first humanist, wrote that the 1,000 years since Rome's fall had been an age of darkness. But now, he believed, light was returning. He collected classical manuscripts, wrote letters to ancient authors as if they were still alive, and pioneered the Renaissance cult of individual genius. Pico della Mirandola, a young philosopher barely out of his teens, wrote his Oration on the Dignity of Man, sometimes called the Manifesto of the Renaissance. Man, he argued, was created without a fixed nature. Angels and animals were locked into their essence, but humans were free to become anything, angel or beast, because we alone possessed the gift of self-determination. You may shape yourself, he said, in whatever form you prefer. Neither heavenly nor earthly, neither mortal nor immortal, we are our own sculptors, free to carve ourselves into whatever form we choose. Machiavelli, more worldly, asked different questions. What is power? How do leaders act, not in heaven, but in cities, in war, in politics? He did not dream of what should be. He observed what was. The Prince, his masterwork, was written in bitter exile after the return of the Medici to Florence ended his political career. Based on his observations of Cesare Borgia and other Renaissance rulers, it described the techniques of acquiring and maintaining political power without reference to traditional Christian virtues. Better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both. A ruler must be both fox and lion, cunning enough to avoid traps, strong enough to frighten wolves. Morality is a luxury that private persons can afford. Rulers must think first of the state's survival. This wasn't cynicism, but realism, an attempt to understand politics as it actually functions rather than as it ought to function in an ideal world. In Florence, in Rome, in Venice, artists painted not just saints, but scientists, not just heavens, but anatomy. Leonardo da Vinci dissected corpses to understand the human form. Michelangelo carved David as the perfect synthesis of classical beauty and Christian spirituality. Architecture recovered the classical orders. Literature rediscovered epic and lyric poetry. Philosophy began to separate itself from theology, not in opposition, but in recognition that the mind had its own legitimate sphere of operation. Montaigne, the great French essayist, pioneered a new literary form perfectly suited to Renaissance individualism. His essays were essay, to capture the movement of his own mind, the flow of his particular thoughts and feelings about love, friendship, death, education, cannibals. What do I know was his motto, not skeptical despair but intellectual humility. Each person, he believed, contains within themselves the full form of the human condition. By studying himself honestly, he was studying humanity, and beneath all of it, a rediscovery of ancient texts. Plato, reborn through the academy of Marsilio Ficino. Aristotle freed from medieval glosses. The Stoics revived for their practical wisdom. Plotinus translated, revealing a mystical Platonism that influenced art and thought for centuries. The mind had opened its eyes again, and what it saw was both wonderful and terrible. Human dignity and human responsibility, human freedom and human finitude, walking hand in hand into an uncertain future. If the Renaissance was a dawn, the Enlightenment was a sun at full height. In the 1600s and 1700s, a confidence spread across Europe, a belief that reason could illuminate all things, that human minds could unlock the workings of nature, build better societies, and understand even themselves. The scientific revolution had shown the power of mathematical reasoning applied to physical phenomena. Galileo's telescope revealed moons around Jupiter, shattering the geocentric cosmos. Newton's Principia showed that the same laws governing falling apples also moved the planets. The universe appeared to be a vast machine, operating according to discoverable principles. If reason could unlock nature's secrets, why not societies? Why not the minds? Descartes, the French mathematician-philosopher, decided to doubt everything that could possibly be doubted. The senses deceive us. Mathematical truths might be implanted by an evil demon. Even our own existence might be illusion. But in the very act of doubting, something remained indubitable. The doubter must exist. Cogito, ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. A foundation built not on faith or tradition, but on the act of thought itself. From this bedrock of certainty, he attempted to rebuild knowledge on purely rational foundations. God exists because we have an idea of perfection, which could only come from a perfect being. The external world exists because God would not deceive us about the evidence of our senses. Mind and matter are distinct substances because we can clearly conceive of thought without extension, extension without thought. Spinoza, the lens-grinding philosopher of Amsterdam, found Descartes' dualism unsatisfying. How could mind and matter interact if they were completely different substances? His solution was radical. There is only one substance, which we call God or nature, Deus sive natura. Mind and matter are not separate things, but two attributes of the same underlying reality. What we experience as thoughts and what we experience as brain states are the same events described in different languages. This pantheistic vision eliminated the problem of free will. Everything follows necessarily from the laws of nature, but also eliminated guilt and fear. We are part of nature, not separate from it. To understand our place in the cosmic order is to find peace. Ethics, for Spinoza, was not about punishment or reward, but harmony with this eternal unfolding. The wise person understands that hatred breeds hatred, that love breeds love, and acts accordingly not from moral duty, but from intellectual insight into the nature of things. Leibniz disagreed with both Descartes and Spinoza. The universe, he argued, was not made of extended substances, but of simple, indivisible, soul-like entities he called monads. Each monad contains within itself the entire history of the universe from its own unique perspective. Like windows without doors, monads do not interact causally. The apparent connections between things result from a pre-established harmony programmed by God at creation. This was, he insisted, the best of all possible worlds, not because it contains no evil, but because any alternative would contain more evil, all things considered. Locke, the English empiricist, challenged the rationalist confidence in innate ideas. The mind at birth, he argued, is a blank slate. Tabula rasa. All knowledge comes from experience, either sensation, knowledge of external objects, or reflection, knowledge of our own mental operations. This had radical implications for politics and education. If there are no innate ideas, then there are no natural hierarchies. Kings rule by consent, not divine right. Social arrangements can be changed through reason and reform. Hume, the Scottish skeptic, pushed empiricism to its logical conclusion and found logic dissolving in his hands. We never observe cause and effect, only sequence. We never perceive the self, only a bundle of sensations. We cannot derive ought from is, moral conclusions from factual premises. Yet somehow we live as if causation, selfhood, and morality are real. Custom and habit, not reason, guide most of our beliefs. We are, Hume concluded, more creatures of feeling than of logic. Kant, the Königsberg philosopher who never traveled more than 60 miles from his birthplace, was awakened from dogmatic slumber by Hume's skepticism. How can we have genuine knowledge if experience gives us only appearances, not reality? His answer revolutionized philosophy. We do not merely perceive the world, we shape it: time, space, cause, effect. These are not just features of the universe, but the lenses through which we see. The mind is not passive but active, organizing the raw data of sensation according to built-in categories. We can never know things in themselves, only things as they appear to us. But this limitation is also liberation. Within the world of appearances, knowledge is possible. Science works because all rational beings share the same cognitive architecture. Morality, he argued, was rooted not in desire or consequences, but in duty. Act only on that rule you could will to become universal law. Treat humanity, whether in yourself or others, always as an end and never merely as means. The categorical imperative stems from reason itself, not from God or human nature or social contract. Moral laws are synthetic a priori, known independently of experience, but informative about reality. Rousseau, the Geneva-born wanderer, challenged Enlightenment optimism from within. Man is born free, he declared, but everywhere he is in chains, not the chains of oppression only, but the subtler bonds of civilization itself. In the state of nature, humans were noble savages, neither good nor evil, but innocent. Society corrupted this innocence, creating inequality, property, and pride. But the solution was not to return to the woods, but to create a social contract based on the general will, the common good, as distinct from the mere sum of individual desires. The French Encyclopédie, edited by Diderot and d'Alembert, attempted to compile all human knowledge in a single work. More than information gathering, it was a manifesto. Knowledge should be public, accessible, freed from the control of church and crown. Voltaire fought against religious superstition and political tyranny, with wit as sharp as any sword. "Crush the infamous thing," he cried, meaning fanaticism in all its forms. But he was no atheist. Rather, he believed in a God discovered through reason rather than revelation. The Enlightenment believed in progress. That knowledge could grow. that reason could liberate, that humanity could rise. And in many ways, it did. Religious wars ended, science advanced, political reforms began. The American and French revolutions proclaimed rights based on reason rather than birth. But not all was light. Some began to feel what reason could not reach. That man was not just a machine of logic, but a creature of longing, fear, and mystery. As the Enlightenment reached its peak, a counter-movement began to stir. Not a rejection of reason, but a recognition of its limits. A remembering of what had been forgotten in the bright clarity of the age of reason. Rousseau had planted the seeds. Feeling is as important as thinking. The heart has its reasons that reason cannot know. We are not merely calculating machines, but beings of passion, imagination, and infinite longing. Romanticism bloomed in the late 18th and early 19th centuries like wildflowers after rain. In poetry, music, art, and philosophy, it proclaimed the value of emotion, nature, and individual experience against the cold abstractions of systematic thought. Kant had shown the limits of pure reason, opening space for practical reason and aesthetic judgment. But his successors wanted more, a philosophy that could encompass the whole of human experience, not just its rational elements. Fichte argued that consciousness itself was the starting point of philosophy, not Descartes' thinking thing, but the pure ego that posits itself and its world through acts of free self-determination. The I creates the not I in order to have something to strive against, to overcome, to know. Schelling saw nature and spirit as two sides of the same absolute reality. Nature unconscious spirit, spirit conscious nature. In aesthetic experience, the division between subject and object disappears. Art reveals truth that science and ordinary consciousness cannot reach. Then came Hegel, the great systematizer, who attempted to show how all contradictions are resolved in the movement of absolute spirit coming to know itself through history. Reality, for Hegel, was not substance but process, not being but becoming. Everything contains its own contradiction, which drives it forward into synthesis with its opposite, thesis, antithesis, synthesis, and the synthesis becomes a new thesis, generating new contradictions ad infinitum. History is the story of consciousness achieving freedom through struggle. Master and slave discover their mutual dependence. Individual and society find their unity in ethical life. Art, religion, and philosophy represent successive stages in spirit's self-understanding. Hegel's owl of Minerva spreads its wings only at dusk. We understand historical periods only after they have passed. Philosophy comes too late to teach the world how it ought to be. It can only help us understand how it had to be. Schopenhauer, deeply influenced by Indian philosophy, saw behind Kant's phenomenal world not reason, but blind will. Irrational, insatiable, the source of all suffering. Life is will, and will is suffering. The only escape is through art, compassion, and ultimately the denial of the will to live itself. Music, he believed, was the direct expression of will, which is why it moves us so powerfully. In aesthetic contemplation, we momentarily escape the tyranny of desire and see the world sub specie aeternitatis, under the aspect of eternity. Kierkegaard, the melancholy Dane, protested against all systems, including Hegel's. Existence is not a problem to be solved, but a reality to be lived. The individual stands alone before God, facing choices that no universal principles can determine. He distinguished three stages of existence: aesthetic, living for pleasure and novelty; ethical, living by universal moral rules; and religious, the leap of faith beyond reason into paradox. Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac exemplifies religious existence beyond good and evil as commonly understood, responsive only to divine command. Truth is subjectivity. We become selves not through thinking, but through passionate commitment, through decisions made in fear and trembling before the absolute. Nietzsche, the philosopher with a hammer, announced the death of God and the need to create new values in a meaningless universe. Christian morality, he argued, was a slave revolt in morals. The weak imposing their values on the strong through guilt and resentment. The Übermensch would be one who creates values rather than discovering them, who says yes to life despite its suffering, who accepts eternal recurrence. The thought that this exact life must be lived infinite times without change. God is dead, he proclaimed, and we have killed him. But this was not celebration, but lament. We had destroyed the source of meaning without finding a replacement. The great challenge was to become gods ourselves, creators of value in a world without inherent purpose. These philosophers, so different in temperament and conclusion, shared a common recognition. Reason alone could not capture the fullness of human experience. We are beings of depth, complexity, contradiction. Any philosophy that ignored this would be incomplete. While German idealists constructed elaborate systems in university lecture halls, the world outside was transforming. The Industrial Revolution was creating new forms of wealth and new forms of misery. Workers crowded into factories and slums. Capital accumulated in fewer hands. The contradictions of modern society demanded not just interpretation, but action. Karl Marx, trained in German philosophy but driven by practical concern, declared that philosophers had only interpreted the world. The point was to change it. History, for Marx, was not the unfolding of absolute spirit, but the story of class struggle. Material conditions determine consciousness, not the reverse. The ideas of any age are the ideas of its ruling class, projected as universal truths. Capitalism, he argued, contained the seeds of its own destruction. Competition drives down wages and drives up unemployment. The rate of profit tends to fall as labor is replaced by machinery. Boom and bust cycles become more severe. The working class grows larger and more organized. But this was not just economic analysis. It was philosophical anthropology. Human beings are fundamentally creative, productive beings. Work should be an expression of our essential nature. Under capitalism, however, work becomes alienated labor. We produce things we do not own, according to processes we do not control, for purposes we do not choose. The worker becomes estranged from the product of his labor, from the act of production, from his own human essence, and from his fellow workers. What should be liberating becomes oppressive. What should connect us divides us. Revolution was inevitable, not because Marx wished it, but because the contradictions of capitalism would eventually become unbearable. The proletariat, having nothing to lose but their chains, would seize the means of production and create a classless society. In the higher phase of communist society, Marx envisioned the antithesis between mental and physical labor would disappear. People could hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, without becoming professional hunters, fishermen, cowboys, or critics. Engels, Marx's lifelong collaborator, extended this materialist analysis to nature itself. Dialectical materialism explained not just human history, but the development of the physical universe. Quantity changes into quality. Contradictions drive development. Progress occurs through struggle. Later, Marxists debated whether this vision was scientific prediction or utopian hope. Lenin emphasized the need for a revolutionary vanguard to guide the working class. Gramsci explored how cultural hegemony maintains ruling class power even without direct coercion. The Frankfurt School analyzed how mass culture and the culture industry prevent revolutionary consciousness from developing, but Marx's central insight endured. Ideas do not float free of material conditions. Philosophy itself is shaped by economic relations, class interests, and historical circumstances. To understand a philosophy fully, we must understand the world that produced it. This was not relativism, but realism, a recognition that thinking beings are also laboring, suffering, striving beings embedded in particular social relationships. Truth itself has a history. The 20th century opened with confidence in progress, reason, and civilization. It ended with 2 world wars, the Holocaust, nuclear weapons, and environmental crisis. The old certainties lay in ruins. New philosophies emerged from the rubble. Existentialism began not as an academic exercise but as a response to lived experience, the experience of anxiety, despair, and radical freedom in a world that seemed to offer no fixed meanings or values. Husserl had developed phenomenology, the careful description of consciousness as it actually appears, without assumptions about what lies behind appearances. The phenomena themselves, he argued, reveal their own structures when examined with sufficient care. Heidegger, his student, asked the most basic question of all: what does it mean to be? Not what things are, but what being itself is. His answer: being is time. We are the beings for whom being is a question. Human existence, Dasein, being there, is fundamentally different from the existence of rocks or tools. We exist in relation to possibilities, not just actualities. We are thrown into existence without choosing it, but we must choose what to make of that existence. Anxiety reveals our radical freedom and responsibility. In moments of deep anxiety, the familiar world loses its meanings. We see that our projects, our values, our very identity could be otherwise. This is terrifying, but also liberating. We are not determined by our past or our circumstances, but free to create ourselves anew. Most of the time, we flee this freedom into conformity, the they-self that does what one does, thinks what one thinks, values what one values. But authentic existence requires owning our mortality, our finitude, our responsibility for the meanings we create. Sartre, writing in occupied Paris, made existentialism a philosophy of freedom and engagement. Existence precedes essence, he declared. We exist first, then create our essence through our choices. There is no human nature that determines what we must become. This radical freedom is the source of anguish. We are condemned to be free, responsible not just for ourselves, but for all humanity, since in choosing we create a picture of what human beings should be. Bad faith is the attempt to escape this responsibility by pretending we are things rather than free consciousnesses. The waiter who over-identifies with his role, the woman who pretends not to notice her companion's advances, the revolutionary who claims his violence is necessitated by historical forces, all are fleeing the anxiety of freedom into the comfort of determinism. Beauvoir, often overshadowed by her more famous partner, developed an existentialist ethics and applied existentialist insights to the situation of women. One is not born, but rather becomes a woman. Gender roles are not natural facts, but social constructions that limit human freedom. The second sex analyzed how women are made into the other, defined always in relation to men, never as autonomous subjects. Liberation requires not just political change, but existential transformation. The recognition that women too are free beings capable of transcendence. Camus, though he rejected the existentialist label, shared the movement's concern with absurdity and authenticity. The human condition is absurd. We seek meaning in a universe that offers none. But this absurdity is not a problem to be solved, but a condition to be embraced. The absurd hero, like Sisyphus eternally pushing his boulder up the mountain, finds dignity not in hope, but in rebellion. There is but one truly serious philosophical problem, Camus wrote, and that is suicide. The question is not whether life has meaning, but whether it is worth living despite its meaninglessness. The answer is yes, but only if we create meaning through our revolt against absurdity, our solidarity with other human beings, and our acceptance of limits. These philosophers wrote not just for academics, but for anyone wrestling with the fundamental questions of human existence. Their insights spread through novels, plays, and films, shaping the culture of the mid-20th century. While continental philosophers explored existence, anxiety, and alienation, a different tradition emerged in the English-speaking world. If the continentals were poets of thought, the Analytics were its engineers, concerned not with grand visions, but with precision, clarity, and logical rigor. Russell and Whitehead attempted to show that mathematics could be reduced to logic, that all mathematical truths were really logical truths in disguise. Their Principia Mathematica was a monument to systematic thinking, 3 volumes proving, with exhaustive logical detail, that 1 + 1 = 2. But Russell's broader project was the logical analysis of ordinary language. Many philosophical problems, he believed, arose from the misleading grammar of natural languages. Logical analysis could dissolve these pseudo-problems by revealing their real structure. Wittgenstein, his brilliant student, took this project even further in his Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus. The world, he argued, is the totality of facts, not things. Language pictures reality by sharing its logical structure. What can be said clearly. What cannot be said clearly cannot be said at all. Most traditional philosophical problems resulted from trying to say what could only be shown: ethics, aesthetics, the meaning of life. These lie beyond the reach of factual discourse. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But Wittgenstein came to reject his early view. Language, he realized, is not a single logical system, but a collection of language games, different ways of using words for different purposes. The meaning of a word is its use in the language game. Philosophy's task is not to construct theories, but to cure us of the bewitchment of language, to show how philosophical problems arise from misunderstanding the logic of our language. The logical positivists of the Vienna Circle attempted to eliminate metaphysics entirely. A statement is meaningful, they argued, only if it can be verified by observation or is true by definition. Ethical and religious claims, being neither empirical nor logical, are literally meaningless. Expressions of emotion disguised as assertions of fact. This verification principle promised to put knowledge on a secure foundation by eliminating all unscientific speculation. Science would expand to cover all meaningful questions. Philosophy would become the logical analysis of scientific concepts. But the program proved impossible to carry out. Observation is theory-laden. Scientific theories cannot be reduced to observation statements. The verification principle itself cannot be verified. Quine delivered the decisive blow in 2 dogmas of empiricism. There is no sharp distinction between analytic and synthetic statements, between logic and fact. Our beliefs form a web in which any statement can be revised if doing so simplifies the overall system. Even logic and mathematics might be changed if the empirical benefits were great enough. Conversely, we might maintain a cherished theory in the face of contrary evidence by adjusting our beliefs about observation. Austin and other ordinary language philosophers shifted attention from ideal logical languages to the analysis of how language actually functions. Speech acts, promising, betting, marrying, don't just describe reality, but change it. Philosophy should study the subtle logic of ordinary usage rather than constructing artificial systems. Searle extended this insight with his theory of speech acts and his Chinese room thought experiment. Understanding involves more than symbol manipulation. It requires conscious awareness of meaning. Computers might process language without understanding it. These philosophers disagreed about many things, but they shared a commitment to clarity, precision, and logical rigor. Philosophy should be a collaborative enterprise aimed at solving well-defined problems rather than expressing personal visions. The 20th century brought both dizzying leaps and shattering doubts. Science soared with relativity and quantum mechanics, changing how we understood reality itself. Space and time were revealed as relative to the observer. Matter and energy proved interchangeable. The act of observation seemed to influence what was observed. These discoveries raised profound philosophical questions. Is there an objective reality independent of observation? What does it mean to say something exists if we cannot observe it without changing it? Ludwig Wittgenstein showed us the limits and power of language, how the words we use shape what we can say and think. Philosophy, he said, is about clarifying thought, like untangling knots in a net. The philosopher is not a theorist but a therapist, curing us of conceptual confusions. Then came Martin Heidegger, exploring being itself. The question of what it means to be in a world that is always becoming, where time is not a line but a lived experience. We are the beings for whom being is a question, thrown into existence without our choosing, but responsible for what we make of that existence. But Heidegger's involvement with Nazism raised disturbing questions about the relationship between philosophical profundity and moral blindness. Can thought be separated from action? Does philosophical genius excuse political evil? Adorno and the Frankfurt School analyzed how instrumental reason, the logic of efficiency and control, had colonized all aspects of modern life. The culture industry manufactures consent through mass entertainment. Science becomes technique without wisdom. Even art is commodified. The dialectic of Enlightenment reveals how reason turns into its opposite, myth. The project of human liberation through knowledge becomes a system of domination over nature and over other human beings. In the mid-century, Michel Foucault and Jacques Derrida deconstructed the ideas we once took as stable: truth, power, identity. They revealed how knowledge is tied to systems of control, how meaning is never fixed but always slipping. Foucault traced the genealogy of modern institutions, prisons, hospitals, schools, showing how they create the subjects they claim to serve. The criminal, the patient, the student are not natural categories but products of disciplinary power. Truth is not discovered but produced through complex networks of power and knowledge. What counts as true, sane, or normal changes historically. There is no neutral standpoint from which to judge these changes. Derrida showed how all texts contain their own contradictions, how meaning is always deferred, never fully present. Deconstruction reveals the instability that inhabits all seeming certainties. Western philosophy, he argued, is based on a series of hierarchical oppositions: speech over writing, presence over absence, being over becoming. Deconstruction shows how these hierarchies depend on what they exclude and ultimately collapse. Postmodernism became less about finding answers and more about unveiling the hidden structures behind those answers. A dance of questions without easy rest. Lyotard proclaimed the end of grand narratives, the great stories that once gave meaning to history. Progress, liberation, truth, all revealed as local language games without universal validity. But this intellectual ferment also produced new possibilities. Feminist philosophers like Irigaray and Cixous explored how gender shapes thought itself. Post-colonial thinkers like Said and Spivak analyzed how knowledge serves imperial power. Philosophy became more diverse, more aware of its own limitations and blind spots. The conversation that began around ancient fires continued, but now it included voices that had long been silenced. Today, philosophy flows in many channels, each reflecting different aspects of our complex present. Philosophy of mind grapples with consciousness, perhaps the deepest mystery of all. How does subjective experience arise from objective brain processes? David Chalmers calls this the hard problem, explaining not just cognitive functions, but why there is something it is like to be us. Some philosophers, like Daniel Dennett, argue that consciousness as we usually conceive it is an illusion. There are only complex information processing systems, no inner theater where experiences are displayed to a central observer. Others, like Thomas Nagel, insist that consciousness reveals something fundamental about reality that physical science cannot capture. What is it like to be a bat? We cannot know, but that there is something it is like seems undeniable. Environmental philosophy, sparked by ecological crisis, asks fundamental questions about our relationship with nature. Deep ecologists like Arne Naess argue for the intrinsic value of all living beings. Ecofeminists connect the domination of women with the domination of nature. Climate change forces us to think on geological timescales, to consider our obligations to future generations, to question the growth-based economics that drives environmental destruction. Applied ethics tackles concrete dilemmas in medicine, technology, and public policy. When is it permissible to end life support? Should we enhance human beings through genetic engineering? How do we distribute scarce resources fairly? Peter Singer's utilitarian approach has revolutionized thinking about animal rights, global poverty, and effective altruism. If we can prevent suffering at small cost to ourselves, we are obligated to do so, regardless of species boundaries or national borders. Political philosophy debates justice in increasingly complex societies. John Rawls argued that just institutions are those we would choose from behind a veil of ignorance, not knowing our place in society, our talents, or our conception of the good. But critics question whether such neutrality is possible or desirable. Communitarians argue that we are always embedded in particular traditions and relationships. Multiculturalists insist that cultural differences must be recognized, not transcended. Philosophy of science examines how knowledge grows and changes. Thomas Kuhn showed that scientific revolutions involve shifts in fundamental paradigms, not just the accumulation of new facts. What counts as good science depends partly on social and psychological factors, not just logical criteria. Feminist philosophers of science reveal how gender bias has shaped scientific theories and practices. The ideal of objectivity itself may mask particular perspectives rather than transcending them. Technology philosophy wrestles with artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and digital culture. If we create machines that think, what moral status do they have? How do algorithms shape social relationships? What does it mean to be human in an age of enhancement and automation? Eastern and Western philosophical traditions continue to cross-pollinate. Buddhist mindfulness practices influence cognitive science. African Ubuntu philosophy challenges individualistic assumptions. Indigenous ways of knowing offer alternatives to Western epistemology. Philosophy today is more global, more inclusive, more aware of its cultural specificity than ever before. The ancient questions persist, but they are asked in new voices, from new perspectives, in response to new challenges, and so we come to the end of our journey. Though, of course, it is not really an end. Philosophy has no final destination because the questions that drive it are inexhaustible. Each answer opens new mysteries. Each solution reveals new problems. We have traveled from the first humans gazing at stars around ancient fires to contemporary thinkers wrestling with artificial intelligence and climate change. The faces have changed. The languages have multiplied. The methods have evolved. But the fundamental questions remain. What is real? How should we live? What can we know? What may we hope? These are not problems to be solved once and for all, but companions for the journey. Every generation must ask them anew in light of its own experience, its own challenges, its own possibilities. You are part of this conversation now. The questions that kept Socrates awake in Athens, that led Augustine to confess his restless heart, that drove Descartes to doubt everything, that helped Kant glimpse the limits of reason. These same questions live in you. When you wonder about the meaning of life, you join company with Buddha and Nietzsche. When you struggle with moral choices, you walk alongside Aristotle and Beauvoir. When you question the nature of reality, you think with Plato and Wittgenstein. Philosophy is not a museum of dead ideas, but a living tradition, a conversation across centuries about what it means to be human. Every time you pause to reflect rather than simply react, every time you ask why instead of what next, every time you wonder whether things could be otherwise, you are doing philosophy. The history we have traced is not just past, but present. Not just theirs, but yours. The questions remain open. The conversation continues. In a world that values quick answers and instant results, philosophy offers something else. The patience to live with questions, the courage to think deeply, the humility to remain open to wonder. The ancient fires still burn. The stars still call us to contemplation. And in the quiet moments between the noise of daily life, we still hear the whisper that started it all. What is this? Who are we? Why? The journey continues, and you are part of it now. Let yourself drift as the ancients did around their fires. Let the questions carry you. Let the wonder return. Philosophy begins in wonder, Aristotle said. And wonder, thankfully, never ends.